Sometimes the most unlikely bonds form in desperate moments. On the dry plains near Dead Rock, a broke cowboy named Amos Creel encounters something extraordinary. A mountain lion, not snarling with rage, but pleading for help. She leads him to her cub, tangled in barbed wire near a ranch that shoots predators on sight. Every bone tells him to walk away, but Amos can't ignore a mother's cry. He frees the cub and hides them both, knowing the danger. When livestock disappears, the town needs someone to blame, and Amos becomes their target. A mob gathers, ready for frontier justice. But what happens next will shake Dead Rock to its core. What would you do if mercy meant losing everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun broke across the Montana plains like a promise that Amos Creel had long stopped believing in. He stood in the doorway of what used to be his family's barn, coffee cup in hand, watching the light spread across land that had once meant everything. The barn sagged now, its red paint peeled away by decades of wind and neglect, revealing weathered grey wood underneath. A section of the roof had collapsed 2 winters back, and Amos hadn't bothered to fix it. What was the point? There were no horses to shelter, no cattle to feed, no reason for a barn except as a monument to better days. He was 43 years old and looked older. The Montana sun had carved lines deep into his face, and his hands were rough as old leather from years of work that never quite paid off. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had once been stronger, back when there was enough food and fewer worries. But his eyes, grey as storm clouds, still held something steady, something that refused to give up entirely, even when giving up would have been easier. The shack he lived in sat 50 yards from the barn, a structure his grandfather had built as temporary housing while constructing the main ranch house. That house had burned down 12 years ago, 3 months after Amos's father died. Some said it was lightning. Amos figured it was just the way his luck ran. He'd rebuilt what he could with the insurance money, but it had only stretched far enough for the shack. 1 room, a wood stove, a bed that creaked like a dying animal every time he turned over. It was enough, barely. Dead Rock lay 6 miles east, a town that had seen better days and knew it. 200 souls, give or take, depending on the season and whether the mines were hiring. The main street consisted of a general store, a saloon, a sheriff's office, a church that had lost its steeple in a windstorm, and a scattering of other buildings that served the basic needs of survival. It wasn't the kind of place people dreamed about. It was the kind of place people ended up. Amos took a sip of his coffee, mostly chicory root these days, real coffee being a luxury he couldn't afford, and pulled his father's pocket watch from his vest. The silver case was tarnished, the crystal face cracked across the middle. It hadn't worked in years, frozen at 3:15, the exact time his father had died. Amos had been holding his hand when it happened, watching the old man's breath go shallow and then stop altogether. The watch had stopped at the same moment, as if time itself had decided that nothing after that point mattered quite as much. His father, Samuel Creel, had been a good man, the kind who kept his word, treated his hands fairly, and believed that if you worked hard enough and honest enough, the land would provide. He'd been wrong about that last part, but Amos couldn't fault him for the belief. 3 hard winters in a row had killed off most of the herd. Disease took the rest. They'd borrowed against the land to buy new stock, but the market crashed before they could sell. Then Samuel got sick, something in his lungs that the doctor in Billings said came from years of breathing dust and cold air. 6 months later he was gone, and Amos was left with debts he couldn't pay and land he couldn't afford to keep. He'd lost it piece by piece. First the north pasture to the bank, then the south range to Ben Calloway, who'd bought it at auction for a fraction of what it was worth. Now all Amos had left was this 40-acre plot, the original homestead his grandfather had claimed. It wasn't enough to ranch on, barely enough to live on, but it was his. The law said so, even if common sense suggested he'd be better off selling it and moving on. But moving on to what? This land was all he knew, all he'd ever known. His mother was buried here, next to his father, under two simple wooden crosses that Amos kept painted white. His childhood was in every rock and tree. Leaving would be like cutting out a part of himself, and he'd already lost enough, so he stayed, and he survived. Odd jobs in town kept him fed, fixing fences for ranchers who'd once competed with his father, mucking stalls, breaking horses when someone needed it. He hunted rabbits and deer when he could, fished the creek when it ran high enough. Margaret Hendry at the general store extended him credit when his pockets ran empty, which was most months. He paid her back when he could, and she never pressed him when he couldn't. She was good people. Dead Rock didn't have many of those, but Margaret was one of them. The town itself was harder. Frontier towns had a way of being suspicious, and Dead Rock was no exception. If you weren't born there, you were an outsider. If you fell on hard times, you were probably weak or foolish. If you'd once had something and lost it, well, that just proved you didn't deserve it in the first place. Amos understood the logic, even if he didn't agree with it. These were people who'd fought for every inch of ground, every scrap of comfort. They didn't have much patience for failure. Ben Calloway embodied that attitude. He owned the largest ranch in the territory, 3,000 acres of prime grazing land that he'd built up through a combination of shrewd business and ruthless acquisition. He'd bought Amos's South Range for pennies and turned it into some of his most productive pasture. There was no love lost between them, but there was a cold respect. Calloway might be hard, but he was also competent. He employed 15 men, supported the church with regular donations, and served on the town council. When Ben Calloway spoke, people listened. Sheriff Wade Dalton was cut from different cloth. He was younger than most lawmen, maybe 35, with a quiet manner that some mistook for weakness. They were wrong. Dalton had been a ranger down in Texas before taking the Dead Rock position, and he'd seen things that aged a man in ways that had nothing to do with years. He enforced the law fairly, which sometimes meant protecting people the town didn't want protected. He'd stood up for Amos more than once when debts came due and tempers ran hot. Not out of charity, Amos figured, but because it was right. Then there was Margaret Hendry, 50-something and widowed, who ran the general store with an efficiency that would shame most bankers. She kept accounts in a cloth-bound ledger, every transaction recorded in her precise handwriting. Amos's page was longer than most, full of sugar and flour and coffee extended on credit, with payments marked in irregular intervals. She'd never once mentioned it to anyone else, never made him feel small for needing the help. Her late husband had been friends with Samuel Creel, and she honored that friendship by looking after his son. It was the kind of loyalty that meant something in a place like Dead Rock. The town had been on edge lately. Livestock had been disappearing. 3 calves from different ranches over the past 2 weeks. A sheep flock raided last month. Predators were part of life out here, everyone knew that. Wolves, coyotes, the occasional bear. But mountain lions were different. They were ghosts, rarely seen, and when they took livestock, they took it clean and careful. The kills they were finding weren't clean. They were desperate, messy. Like something was hunting out of hunger, not instinct. Calloway had called a town meeting about it the week before. Amos had sat in the back, trying not to draw attention. Calloway had stood at the front of the church, laying out the losses in hard numbers. He'd proposed organizing a hunting party, putting out poison, whatever it took to solve the problem. Sheriff Dalton had counseled patience, suggested waiting to see if the predator moved on naturally. The room had been divided, but Amos could see which way the wind was blowing. Fear made people want action, and action usually meant killing something. Now, standing in his doorway with cold coffee and a broken watch, Amos wondered what he'd do if he found the predator. Would he kill it to protect the ranchers who barely tolerated him? Would he let it go and risk their anger? The questions felt hypothetical, distant. He wasn't a hunter by nature, despite growing up on a ranch. He'd killed animals for food, put down sick cattle when necessary, but he'd never enjoyed it. His father used to say that the mark of a good rancher was respecting the animals in your care, understanding that you were a steward, not a conqueror. That philosophy hadn't saved the ranch, but it had shaped the man Amos had become. He finished his coffee, tossed the grounds into the dirt, and looked at the day ahead. He had a job helping Dalton repair some fence line near the old Cooper place, work that would pay enough for flour and maybe some bacon if he was lucky. Then he'd check his traps, see if he'd caught anything. After that, who knew? Each day was pretty much like the last out here, a series of small tasks that added up to survival. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, circling over the plains in search of prey. Amos watched it for a moment, envying its freedom, its simplicity of purpose. Then he set his cup inside, grabbed his hat and work gloves, and headed for the barn to saddle his horse. The mare was old, like everything else he owned, but she was steady and sure-footed. He'd named her Patience years ago, before he'd really understood what the word meant. Now he did. Patience was what got you through hard times. Patience and the stubborn refusal to lie down and quit. As he rode out toward the Cooper place, Amos thought about his father's watch, still frozen at 3:15. Maybe that was fitting. Maybe his own life had stopped at that moment too, and everything since had just been going through the motions. But then again, maybe time didn't really stop. Maybe it just changed shape, measured itself in different ways. Not hours and minutes, but seasons and storms, small kindnesses and smaller victories. The plains stretched out before him, endless and indifferent. Somewhere out there, a predator was hunting. Somewhere out there, life continued its ancient patterns, caring nothing for human worries or human laws. Amos was part of that world, whether dead rock acknowledged it or not. He was part of the land, the wind, the turning of seasons. And for now, that would have to be enough. He rode on, his shadow long in the morning sun, just another figure in a landscape that had seen countless others come and go. The day would bring what it brought. The future would arrive whether he was ready or not. All he could do was keep moving forward, one hoofbeat at a time, and trust that somewhere ahead there was still a reason for all of it. His father's watch might have stopped. But Amos Creel hadn't. Not yet. 3 days later, Amos found himself riding the eastern boundary of what used to be his family's South Range, now Ben Calloway's property. The fence work with Dalton had paid him enough for a week's worth of supplies, and he'd decided to check his trap line on the way home. The morning was crisp, the kind of cold that cleared your head and made every breath feel deliberate. Dawn had broken maybe an hour before, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded him why, despite everything, he still loved this land. Patience moved carefully along the rocky trail, her ears swiveling at every sound. Amos noticed her nervousness, but didn't think much of it. Horses had their moods, same as people. He was more focused on watching for the small stakes that marked his traps, scattered along the property line, where rabbits liked to run. That's when he saw her. The mountain lion stood directly in the middle of the trail, maybe 30 yards ahead. She was massive, easily 140 pounds, her tawny coat catching the early light. But it wasn't her size that stopped Amos cold. It was her posture. She wasn't crouched to spring, wasn't showing teeth or flattening her ears in aggression. She was simply standing there, watching him, waiting. Patience froze beneath him, every muscle tense. Amos's hand moved instinctively to the rifle in his saddle scabbard, but something made him pause. In 43 years of living on these plains, he'd seen maybe a dozen mountain lions. Every single one had vanished the moment it noticed a human. They were ghosts, shadows that wanted nothing to do with people. But this one stood her ground. The lion made a sound, not a growl, but something else. A vocalization he'd never heard from a predator, almost plaintive. Then she did something that made Amos's breath catch. She turned deliberately and took several steps off the trail, then looked back at him. Waiting. You trying to tell me something? Amos spoke quietly, more to steady his own nerves than anything else. The lion's ears flicked forward at the sound of his voice. Then she repeated the motion, moving away, looking back. Every instinct screamed at him to turn Patience around and ride hard for home. Mountain lions were unpredictable. This behavior was wrong, unnatural. It could be rabies, some sickness that broke down the animal's natural fear. But even as these thoughts raced through his mind, Amos found himself dismounting. He tied Patience to a sturdy juniper, pulled his rifle from the scabbard, and started walking. The lion moved ahead of him, maintaining distance but clearly expecting him to follow. She led him off the trail and through a stand of cottonwoods, their branches still bare from winter. The ground sloped downward toward a dry creek bed, and that's where Amos heard it, a high-pitched cry that made his chest tighten. Not human, but carrying the same note of distress that transcended species. He came around a boulder and saw the cub. It was maybe 4 months old, still spotted with juvenile markings, and it was caught in barbed wire, the kind of cheap fencing Calloway had strung along parts of his property line to save money. The cub must have tried to squeeze through and gotten tangled. The wire was wrapped around its right front leg and part of its shoulder, cutting deep into the flesh. Blood had dried in dark patches on the cub's fur, and fresh blood welled up with each movement. The animal was exhausted, its cries weak now, eyes glassy with pain and fear. The mother lion had stopped 20 feet away, watching Amos. Her body language was clear. She was terrified for her baby, but wouldn't approach any closer while a human was present. Her eyes held something that Amos recognized, something that cut through the boundaries of species. Desperation, plea, the same look he'd seen in his father's eyes in those final days. Asking for help that Amos couldn't give. "Easy now," Amos said softly, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the cub, the mother, or himself. He propped his rifle against a rock, keeping it within reach but making his hands visible. The cub watched him approach with wide amber eyes, too weak to struggle anymore. This was Calloway's land. Calloway's fence. Calloway's policy to shoot predators on sight, no exceptions. If Amos cut this cub free and Calloway found out, there would be hell to pay. The man already resented Amos for being a reminder of old competition, old failures. And if the town learned that Amos had helped the very predator they'd been talking about hunting down, the consequences could be worse than resentment. But as Amos knelt beside the injured cub, those calculations seemed to happen in some distant part of his brain, separate from the part that was already pulling his work knife from his belt. The cub flinched at his approach, tried to pull away, but the wire held it fast. Fresh blood ran down its leg. "I know," Amos murmured. "I know it hurts. But you have to let me help." He started with the wire around the shoulder, carefully cutting and unwinding. The metal had cut deep, and he had to work slowly to avoid making the wounds worse. The cub whimpered, its breath coming in rapid pants, but it didn't try to bite him. Perhaps it understood in some primal way that this human was trying to help. Or perhaps it was simply too exhausted to fight anymore. The mother lion paced in the background, making soft chirping sounds, the way mothers communicate with their young. Amos could feel her eyes on him, could sense her barely contained tension. If she decided he was hurting rather than helping, she could cover the distance between them in seconds. He'd be dead before he could reach his rifle. But he kept working. The last section of wire was the hardest. It had twisted around the leg joint, embedded in the muscle. Amos had to use his fingers to pry it away, the sharp barbs cutting into his own palms. He felt warm blood, his and the cub's, making his hands slick. The cub cried out as the wire came free, a sound that made Amos's throat tight. "Done," he said, sitting back on his heels. "You're free." The cub tried to stand, but its injured leg buckled. It collapsed in the dirt, panting. The wounds were bad, deep lacerations that would get infected without treatment. Even if it survived, the leg might never work properly again. A wild animal with a crippled leg was a dead animal, just slower. The mother lion approached cautiously, sniffing her baby, licking at the wounds. She looked at Amos again, and he could swear there was understanding in those wild eyes. "Thanks, maybe?" Or another plea. "Fix this." Amos stood, retrieved his rifle, and started back toward Patience. He'd done what he could. The cub was free. Whatever happened now was nature's business, not his. But halfway back to the trail, he stopped. The image of that small, broken body wouldn't leave his mind. The mother's desperate eyes. The way the cub had looked at him with something almost like trust. He thought about his father, about all those times Samuel Creel had told him that a man's character showed in what he did when nobody was watching, when there was no reward and every risk. He thought about the pocket watch frozen at 3:15, about time stopped and time moving forward. About the difference between surviving and living, damn it, Amos said to the empty air. He went back to where the lions waited. The mother tensed as he approached, but didn't retreat. Amos pulled off his jacket, his only good one, the one he saved for town, and carefully wrapped the cub in it. The animal was too weak to resist. He picked it up, surprised by how light it felt, how fragile. The mother lion made a sound that was almost a growl, but Amos spoke to her. If you want your baby to live, you let me take it. Understand? I can help, but you can't follow me into town. You stay out here, stay hidden. He had no idea if the lion could understand his words, but she understood his tone. She watched as he carried her cub back to patience. The horse shied at the scent of predator, but Amos soothed her with familiar words and managed to secure the bundle across the saddle. The cub whimpered but didn't struggle. As Amos mounted up, he saw the mother lion following at a distance. She wouldn't leave her baby. He'd expected that. All he could do was lead her away from Calloway's land, away from the ranches, back to his own small plot where he might buy them both some time. He rode slowly, checking over his shoulder every few minutes. The mother kept pace, a tawny shadow moving through the brush. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the full weight of what he'd done. He'd committed himself to protecting the very animal the town wanted dead. He'd used his last good jacket to carry it, and he had no idea what he'd do next. But as he felt the small warmth of the cub against his leg, heard its labored breathing, Amos found he didn't regret the choice. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. Not for profit, not for survival, but because it was right. Because a mother had asked for help and he'd answered. The plains stretched out before him, and somewhere behind, the mother lion followed. Amos Creel rode toward his broken-down barn with a wounded predator in his arms, and no plan beyond the next few hours. But his hands, bleeding from barbed wire cuts, held steady on the reins. And if anyone had been watching his face, they might have seen something there that hadn't been present in years, a quiet sense of purpose. The barn smelled of old hay and mouse droppings, but it had 4 walls and most of a roof, which was more than Amos could say for a lot of structures on his property. He'd cleared out the back stall years ago when he'd sold his last horse, and now he carried the cub there, still wrapped in his jacket. The animal had grown quiet during the ride, which worried him more than the crying had. Quiet often meant giving up. He laid the cub on a bed of straw he'd hastily spread, then stepped back to assess the situation he'd gotten himself into. Through the gaps in the barn wall, he could see the mother lion prowling the perimeter, her movements agitated but controlled. She wanted to be with her baby, but some instinct kept her from entering the human structure. Amos wondered how long that would last. "You stay out there," he called to her. "Give me a chance to help." The first priority was the wounds. Amos had treated plenty of animals in his ranching days, horses, cattle, even the occasional dog that got into a fight with something wild. But he'd never worked on a predator before, and certainly not one whose mother was waiting outside, ready to tear him apart if things went wrong. He went to his shack and gathered what supplies he had. A bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for a particularly hard day, clean rags torn from an old shirt, his sewing kit, and a tin of salve he'd bought from a traveling medicine man the previous summer. It probably wasn't much good, but it was something. He also grabbed the remains of a rabbit he'd trapped 2 days ago and a bucket of water from the well. Back in the barn, the cub watched him approach with wary eyes. It tried to stand when he got close, but collapsed again with a pitiful sound. Amos knelt slowly, speaking in the same low, steady tone he'd used with nervous horses. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you more than I have to. But these wounds need cleaning, or you're not going to make it." He started by offering the cub water in a shallow pan. It sniffed suspiciously, but then drank, its small pink tongue lapping eagerly. Thirst was good, meant the animal still had enough fight left to want to survive. While it drank, Amos examined the wounds more carefully. The barbed wire had cut through fur and flesh, leaving ragged tears across the shoulder and a deep gash on the leg. The leg was the worst. Swollen, the skin around the cuts already showing signs of infection. He soaked a rag in whiskey and began cleaning the wounds. The cub yowled and tried to pull away, but Amos held firm, talking constantly. "I know it burns. Lord knows it burns. But infection will kill you sure as anything, and we can't have that. Your mama's counting on me to fix you up." The cleaning took the better part of an hour. His hands, already cut from the wire, stung from the whiskey, but he didn't stop. When he finally finished, the wounds looked better, clean at least, though still ugly. The leg worried him most. It needed support, something to keep the joint stable while it healed. Amos sat back thinking. Then he remembered the cottonwood grove where he'd found the cub. The wood there was soft, easy to carve. He could make a splint, bind it with strips of leather from an old harness. It wasn't veterinary medicine, but it was the best he could do. "I'll be back," he told the cub. "You rest." He rode back to the grove, keeping watch for signs of Calloway's hands. The last thing he needed was questions about why he was cutting branches on property that wasn't his. But the land was empty, just wind and grass and the distant cry of a hawk. He selected 2 straight pieces of cottonwood, each about a foot long and thick as his thumb, and carved them smooth with his knife. The wood was green and would dry hard, perfect for his purpose. Back at the barn, he found the mother lion closer than before, maybe 20 feet from the door. She growled when she saw him, a deep rumble that made his skin prickle. But she didn't charge. Amos figured she'd calculated the same thing he had. Right now, he was her cub's best chance at survival. Inside, the cub had fallen into an exhausted sleep. Amos worked quickly, shaping the splint pieces to fit along either side of the injured leg, padding them with strips of cloth, then binding everything with thin leather straps from an old harness. He'd done similar work on a calf once, years ago, when it had broken its leg in a gopher hole. The calf had healed. He hoped the same would be true here. The cub woke during the binding process and fought weakly, but Amos's hands were gentle and sure. When he finished, the leg was immobilized, the wounds protected. It wasn't pretty, but it would serve. He applied the salve liberally, wincing at how little he had left, then covered everything with clean bandages. "There," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "That's the best I can do. The rest is up to you." He offered the cub some of the rabbit meat, torn into small pieces. The animal sniffed it, then began to eat with surprising enthusiasm. That was good. Appetite meant will to live. Amos watched, feeling something warm spread through his chest. Pride, maybe, or satisfaction. Or just the simple pleasure of seeing something broken start to mend. Night was falling by the time he finished. The mother lion had settled near the barn, a darker shadow among shadows. Amos considered going to his shack, getting some sleep in his own bed. But the cub might need water in the night, or the bandages might need adjusting. And if the mother decided to come inside, he wanted to be there to prevent a disaster. He spread his bedroll in the stall next to the cub's, close enough to monitor but not so close as to seem threatening. The barn was cold, and he'd given up his jacket, so he wrapped himself in an old blanket that smelled of horse and dust. Through the walls, he could hear the mother lion moving, pacing, settling, then pacing again. Her anxiety was palpable. "She'll be okay," Amos called out. "I'll watch over her." Whether the lion understood or not, she eventually settled into quieter movements. Amos lay in the dark, listening to the cub's breathing, rapid but steady. He thought about the absurdity of his situation. A broke cowboy, barely keeping himself alive, now responsible for keeping a mountain lion cub alive. If anyone in Dead Rock could see him now, they'd call him crazy. And maybe they'd be right. But as he drifted toward sleep, his last thought was of the mother lion's eyes when he'd freed her cub from the wire. That look of desperate hope. No one had looked at Amos Creel with hope in a very long time. It felt good. It felt like maybe he still had something to offer the world. Even if it was just this, caring for a wounded animal that by all rights should fear and hate him. The night deepened. And in the darkness, a penniless man and a predator's cub slept in an uneasy truce, while outside, a mother kept watch over them both. It was the strangest arrangement Amos had ever been part of. But somehow it felt more right than anything he'd done in years. Morning came with pale light, and the realization that Amos Creel had trapped himself in a situation he couldn't sustain. The cub had made it through the night. That was the good news. It was drinking water, eating the meat he offered, and even seemed slightly stronger. The splint was holding, and the wounds, while still serious, didn't look worse. But Amos's supplies were nearly exhausted. The whiskey was gone, the salve was almost gone, and he had maybe one more day's worth of food for himself, let alone a growing carnivore. He needed to go to town, and that meant leaving the cub and facing questions. The mother lion had spent the night near the barn, and this morning she'd brought an offering, a freshly killed rabbit, its neck cleanly broken. She'd left it near the barn door, then retreated to the ridge above his property. Amos stared at the rabbit for a long moment, trying to understand the meaning. Was it gratitude? Payment? An attempt to provide for her cub through him? Whatever it was, it moved him in ways he couldn't quite name. He picked up the rabbit and brought it inside for the cub. "Your mama's a hunter," he told the small cat, watching it tear into the meat with renewed vigor. "You're going to be fine. I just need to get a few things from town and then I'll be back. You understand?" The cub, of course, said nothing. But when Amos left the barn, securing the door as best he could with rope and a bent nail, he felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper on his shoulders. This animal was depending on him. The mother was trusting him. It was a strange and fragile bond, but it was real. The ride to Dead Rock took just under an hour. Amos used the time to rehearse his story. The scratches on his hands and arms were visible, still raw. If anyone asked, he'd say he'd been clearing brush, got tangled in some old wire. It was plausible enough. Nobody would suspect the truth, because the truth was too strange to imagine. The town was busier than usual when he arrived. Several wagons were clustered near the general store, and a group of men stood outside the saloon, even though it was barely 9 in the morning. Amos felt their eyes on him as he tied Patience to the hitching post. Their expressions weren't friendly. He pushed open the door to Margaret Hendry's store, and a small bell chimed. The interior was dim and crowded with goods, barrels of flour and sugar, shelves of canned foods, tools hanging from the ceiling, fabric bolts stacked in one corner. It smelled of coffee and soap and sawdust. Margaret stood behind the counter, helping Mrs. Peterson with a list of items. She looked up when Amos entered, and her eyes went immediately to his hands. "Amos," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Be with you in just a moment." He nodded and pretended to examine a display of lantern oil while Mrs. Peterson finished her business. The older woman glanced at him as she left, her mouth tight with some judgment she didn't voice. When the door closed behind her, Margaret came around the counter. "Let me see those hands," she said without preamble. "They're fine. Just some scratches. Amos Creel, I've known you since you were 10 years old. Let me see." He held out his hands, palms up. The cuts from the barbed wire were obvious, some of them deep enough that they'd probably leave scars. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "What happened?" "Clearing some old fence line. Got careless." She studied him for a long moment, and he could see her sharp mind working behind those steady grey eyes. Margaret Hendry hadn't survived widowhood and 40 years in a frontier town by being easily fooled. But whatever she suspected, she kept it to herself. "Those need proper bandaging," she said. "Wait here." She went to the back room and returned with clean cloth and a jar of something that smelled of herbs. As she cleaned and wrapped his hands, she spoke quietly. "There was another calf killed last night. On the Henderson place, north of here. Ben Calloway is organizing a meeting this evening at the church. Says it's time to deal with this predator problem once and for all." Amos's stomach tightened. What's he planning? Hunting party, maybe poison stations, I don't know exactly, but he's angry, Amos. And when Ben Calloway gets angry, people tend to follow his lead. She finished wrapping his left hand and started on the right. "You be careful. Times like this, folks start looking for someone to blame. Sometimes that's an animal, sometimes it's a person who doesn't fit in quite right. I haven't done anything wrong. I know that. But perception matters more than truth when people are scared. She tied off the bandage and looked at him directly. Is there something you need to tell me? The question hung between them, full of weight. Amos thought about the cub in his barn, the mother lion watching from the ridge, the impossible responsibility he'd taken on. Part of him wanted to tell Margaret everything, to share the burden, but he couldn't risk it. Not yet. Not when the town was ready to hunt. I need some supplies, he said instead. Bandages, if you can spare them. Salt, flour, and if you have any of that antiseptic powder, I could use some. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. Understanding or suspicion, or both. She went to gather the items without another word. When she returned, she set them on the counter and pulled out her cloth-bound ledger, the one where she kept all her accounts. Amos watched as she turned to his page. The list of debts was long, each line representing a purchase he'd promised to pay back someday. She added the new items, her handwriting precise. Then she paused. This antiseptic powder is expensive, Amos. Are you sure you need it? I'm sure. She wrote it down, then closed the ledger. You know I can't extend credit forever. Eventually the numbers have to balance. I know, and they will, I promise. She looked at him for a long moment, then surprised him by smiling, small, sad, but genuine. Your father used to make promises like that. Always meant them too. That's what I choose to believe about you. Thank you, Margaret. Don't thank me. Just be smart. Whatever you're mixed up in, be smart about it. He gathered his supplies and was heading for the door when it opened. Sheriff Dalton stepped in, his presence filling the small space. He nodded to Margaret, then turned to Amos. Got a minute? I was just leaving. Won't take long. They stepped outside into the sharp morning air. Dalton leaned against the porch, railing, his eyes scanning the street before settling on Amos. There's talk about you. There's always talk about me. Different kind of talk. Frank Henderson saw you riding near Calloway's property yesterday morning. Says you were acting strange, heading off into the brush like you were following something. Amos kept his expression neutral. I was checking my trap line. Find anything? Few rabbits. Nothing special. Dalton was quiet for a moment, and Amos could feel the lawman's instincts working. Wade Dalton might be fair, but he was also sharp. Amos, if you know something about these livestock kills, you need to tell me, before Calloway and his men take matters into their own hands. I don't know anything about livestock kills, but you know something. Amos met his eyes. I know that. Sometimes the simplest answer is to let nature take its course. Predators come and go. Maybe this one will move on, and maybe it won't, and maybe people will die waiting for that to happen. Dalton straightened, his hand resting on his belt near his pistol. Not a threat, just habit. Be at the church meeting tonight. 7 o'clock? And Amos, if there's something you're not telling me, now's the time. He waited, but Amos said nothing. Finally, Dalton nodded and walked away, leaving Amos standing on the porch with his supplies and his secrets. The ride back to his property felt longer than usual, every shadow seeming like a potential threat. When he finally reached his barn, the mother lion was nowhere in sight, but he could feel her presence, watching, waiting. Inside, the cub was awake and alert, its amber eyes tracking his movements. Amos set down his supplies and checked the splint. Still secure. The wounds looked better, maybe. Or maybe that was just hope talking. We're in trouble, he told the small cat. The whole town's hunting for your mama, and I've got to figure out how to protect you both, while looking like I've got nothing to hide. The cub made a small chirping sound, and despite everything, Amos smiled. Yeah, I know. Not much of a plan, but it's what we've got. He spent the afternoon reinforcing the barn door, adding extra rope and a bar across the inside. If anyone came looking, he needed to be able to keep them out long enough to hide the cub. Where he'd hide a mountain lion cub, he had no idea. But one problem at a time. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, Amos changed into his least-worn shirt and prepared to ride back to town for the meeting. Before he left, he stood in the barn doorway, looking at the cub. Your mama brought me a rabbit this morning, he said, like she was paying me for my help. I've been thinking about that, about what it means when something wild trusts you. I haven't been trusted with much lately. Haven't deserved it, maybe. But I won't let you down. That's a promise." The cub tilted its head, and for just a moment Amos could swear it understood. Then he turned away, climbed onto Patience, and rode toward Dead Rock and whatever confrontation waited there. Behind him, hidden in the brush, the mother lion watched him go. And in the barn, her cub settled into the straw, the hand-carved splint holding steady, a small life healing in the care of a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to matter. The town meeting had been worse than Amos expected. Ben Calloway had stood at the front of the church, his face red with anger, tallying the losses. 8 calves now, 2 sheep, and a goat. Each one represented money from someone's pocket, and in a place like Dead Rock, money was survival. The crowd had been restless, angry, demanding action. Sheriff Dalton had tried to counsel restraint, but his voice was drowned out by calls for a hunting party. In the end, Calloway had gotten his way. A dozen men would start tracking the predator at first light. They'd work in pairs, covering all the likely territories. Any mountain lion they found would be shot on sight. The bounty was $50, more money than most of these men saw in a month. Amos had sat in the back, silent, watching the faces around him transform from neighbors into something harder. Fear did that to people, made them dangerous. When the meeting ended, he'd slipped out before anyone could ask him to join the hunt. That had been 2 weeks ago. Since then, Amos had lived in a state of constant vigilance. The cub, he'd started calling her Scout in his mind, though he tried not to, was healing better than he dared hope. The wounds had closed clean, no sign of infection. The splint had done its job, and though the leg was still weak, Scout could put weight on it now. She'd grown stronger, more active, testing the bounds of the barn with increasing boldness, and she'd grown attached to Amos in a way that both warmed and worried him. Every morning when he entered the barn, Scout would chirp in greeting, a sound that seemed impossibly gentle from a predator. She'd rub against his legs the way a house cat might, though she was already twice that size and growing fast. When he changed her bandages, she'd lean into his touch instead of pulling away. She'd started playing with bits of rope and old leather, pouncing and batting with the clumsy enthusiasm of any young animal. The mother lion had settled into a pattern as well. She hunted in the early mornings and late evenings, always returning to check on Scout. She left kills near the barn, rabbits, once a small deer, provisions for her cub. And for Amos, who ate better those weeks than he had in months. It was an arrangement that defied everything he knew about wild animals, but it worked. Still, the hunting parties were out there. Amos had seen them from his ridge, pairs of men on horseback, scanning the landscape with rifles ready. Twice they'd come close enough that he'd had to hide Scout in an old root cellar beneath the barn, covering the entrance with hay bales and praying she'd stay quiet. Both times, the mother lion had vanished into the high country, her instincts keeping her safe. Both times, Amos had faced the men with a calm he didn't feel, offering coffee and small talk while his heart hammered against his ribs. Today, alone in his shack while Scout napped, Amos found himself searching through an old trunk for supplies. He pulled out worn clothes, tools missing handles, a set of his mother's dishes he couldn't bring himself to use. At the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, he found his father's Bible. He hadn't looked at it in years. Samuel Creel had read from it every Sunday, his voice steady and sure, finding comfort in the familiar words. Amos had never shared his father's faith. Too many unanswered prayers, too much suffering that seemed random and cruel. But he unwrapped the book now, running his fingers over the worn leather cover. The pages fell open to Proverbs, and Amos saw that his father had underlined certain passages in pencil. One caught his eye: the righteous care for the needs of their animals, but the kindest acts of the wicked are cruel. His father's handwriting in the margin noted simply, stewardship. Amos turned pages, finding more underlined sections, more notes. In the book of Micah, what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly, his father had written. The land teaches this if we listen. For a long time, Amos sat with the Bible open on his lap, reading passages his father had marked important. They were all about mercy, about justice, about the responsibility of the strong to protect the weak. Samuel Creel had believed these things weren't just pretty words, but actual guides for living. "Even when it cost him, you'd probably tell me I did the right thing," Amos said to the empty room, to his father's memory. "Even knowing what it might cost. That's the kind of man you were." He closed the Bible carefully, rewrapped it, and set it on the small shelf above his bed where he could see it. Then he heard hoofbeats approaching, and his blood went cold. Through the window, he saw a rider coming up the trail, one of Calloway's ranch hands, a young man named Pete, whom Amos recognized but didn't know well. There was no time to hide Scout or warn the mother lion. All he could do was step outside and try to look casual. "Pete," Amos called out in greeting. "What brings you out this way?" The young man dismounted, his expression tense. "Mr. Calloway asked me to check this area. We've been tracking something. Big cat tracks leading this direction." Amos's mouth went dry, but he kept his voice level. "That right? Well, you're welcome to look around. Don't have much out here worth a mountain lion's attention." Pete's eyes swept the property, taking in the barn, the shack, the empty corrals. "Those your tracks?" He pointed to the ground near the barn door, large paw prints in the dust that Amos had tried to sweep away, but hadn't quite managed. "Been seeing some signs," Amos admitted, his mind racing. "Figure there's something passing through, but I haven't seen it directly. Could be just traveling, you know. Animals have territories. Mr. Calloway says we need to check every building, every structure. Make sure nothing's hiding somewhere it shouldn't." This was it. Amos could refuse, but that would only make Pete more suspicious. He could let him search and hope Scout stayed quiet in the barn. Or he could— "Tell you what," Amos said, thinking fast. "I've got some traps set up in the ravine north of here. Found fresh tracks there this morning. Why don't I show you? Could be your cats holed up there. Better than searching empty buildings." Pete hesitated, clearly torn between his orders and the promise of actually finding something. The desire to be the one who located the predator, claimed the bounty, won out. "All right, show me." Amos saddled Patience quickly, his hands shaking slightly but his movements steady. As he led Pete away from the barn, he caught a glimpse of movement on the ridge, the mother lion watching. He sent up a silent prayer that she'd stay hidden, that Scout would stay quiet, that this gamble would work. He led Pete on a winding route through the roughest terrain, pointing out tracks that might or might not be fresh, discussing the habits of mountain lions with an authority he'd gained from books and observation. He knew he was buying time, nothing more. Eventually, Pete would report back to Calloway. Eventually, someone would search his barn, regardless of what Amos said. But for now, he led the young ranch hand away from his property, talking about predators and territories and the wildness that couldn't be fully tamed. And in the barn behind them, Scout slept peacefully, her splinted leg healing, her trust in the strange human who'd saved her absolute and complete. When they finally parted ways near the old Cooper place, Pete seemed satisfied that he'd done his due diligence. "Thanks for your help, Amos. If you see anything, you let us know here." "Will do," Amos lied. He watched Pete ride toward Calloway's ranch, then turned Patience toward home. The afternoon sun was slanting low, painting the plains in amber and gold. Somewhere out there, the mother lion was hunting. Somewhere in his barn, her cub was healing. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Amos Creel was trying to hold together a secret that grew more fragile with each passing day. That night, sitting in the barn with Scout curled near his feet, Amos pulled out his father's pocket watch. 3:15. Time stopped and time moving forward. He thought about the Bible passages, about stewardship and mercy, about his father's belief that some things were worth protecting regardless of cost. "I don't know how this ends," he told Scout, "but I know I can't stop now. You're counting on me. Your mama's counting on me. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us get. Someone to count on us, and the chance to not let them down." Scout made a soft sound and shifted closer to him, seeking warmth. Amos rested his hand on her head, feeling the soft fur, the warmth of life. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of approaching change. The hunting parties would continue. The town's fear would grow. The secret couldn't hold forever. But tonight, in this moment, a man and a predator's cub sat together in companionable silence, connected by something deeper than fear or instinct. Trust, perhaps, or simple kindness in a world that had grown short on both. It wasn't much, but right now it was everything. 3 weeks into his unlikely guardianship, Amos realized he'd made a critical miscalculation. Scout was nearly healed. The splint had come off 2 days ago, and though she still favored the legs slightly, she was moving well, strong, wild. The problem was that she was also becoming too comfortable with him, too dependent, and the longer she stayed, the harder it would be to release her. He knew what needed to happen. He needed to take Scout far into the mountains, release her with her mother, give them both a chance to disappear into territory where men like Calloway couldn't reach them. But each day, he told himself he'd do it tomorrow. Just one more day to make sure the leg was strong enough. Just one more day to be certain the wounds wouldn't reopen. Just one more day. The truth, which he barely admitted to himself, was that he'd grown attached. Scout represented something he hadn't felt in years, purpose beyond mere survival. Someone needed him. That mattered more than he'd expected. He was sitting in his shack, trying to figure out how to provision a trip into the high country with almost no money, when he heard a wagon approaching. Through the window he saw Margaret Hendry's familiar rig, pulled by her steady old mule. His stomach dropped. Margaret never came out to his place? Never? He met her at the door, trying to keep his expression neutral. "Margaret, this is unexpected." She climbed down from the wagon with a basket on her arm, her movements brisk despite her age. "Thought I'd bring you some supplies. You haven't been to town in over a week, and I figured you might be running low." It was a kind gesture, but Amos knew Margaret well enough to recognize there was more to it. "That's thoughtful. Come inside. I'll make coffee. Let's walk a bit first," she said, glancing toward the barn. "Show me your property." "Been years since I've been out here." They walked slowly across the scrubby ground, Margaret's sharp eyes taking in everything, the condition of the buildings, the tracks in the dust, the disturbed areas near the barn. She was observant, always had been. Amos felt sweat forming despite the cool morning air. "You keeping livestock now?" she asked casually. "No, why?" "Just seems like there's been activity. Large tracks? Disturbances?" She stopped and looked at him directly. "Amos, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm asking as a friend, not as someone looking to judge." He waited, his heart hammering. "Are you protecting something out here? Something that maybe you shouldn't be?" For a long moment Amos considered lying, but this was Margaret, who'd extended him credit when no one else would, who'd never once made him feel small for his failures. If he couldn't trust her, he couldn't trust anyone. "Yes," he said simply. She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed what she'd already suspected. "The mountain lion?" "Her cub. It was caught in barbed wire, injured badly. The mother brought me to it, Margaret. Led me right to it like she knew I could help. I couldn't just walk away. So you've been hiding it here? For weeks? I've been treating its wounds, making sure it can survive when I release it." Margaret was quiet, her face unreadable. Then she asked, "Show me." Amos hesitated, but he'd already crossed the line by admitting the truth. He led her to the barn, calling out softly as he opened the door. "Scout, it's just me. And a friend." Scout was curled in her usual spot, but stood when they entered, her amber eyes wary. She was beautiful, nearly full-sized now, her coat gleaming, the scars from her injuries barely visible. When she saw Amos, she chirped in greeting and padded toward him, moving with only the slightest limp. Margaret gasped softly. "Lord have mercy, you really did it. You saved her." Scout approached cautiously, sniffing at Margaret. To the older woman's credit, she stood perfectly still, letting the young lion investigate. When Scout was satisfied, she returned to Amos's side, leaning against his leg. "She's bonded to you," Margaret observed. "That's going to make releasing her difficult. I know. I've been putting it off, but it has to happen soon. The hunting parties are still out there. If they find her here—" He didn't finish the thought. They stepped back outside, and Margaret pulled him toward the shade of a cottonwood. "There's another town meeting tomorrow night. Calloway's calling it. The livestock killings have continued, and people are getting more desperate. Some are saying we need to put out poison stations. Others want to bring in professional hunters from Billings. It's getting ugly, Amos. The mother lion is just trying to feed herself while staying close to her cub. Once I release them both far enough away, you think they'll just forget. You think Calloway will call off the hunt? Margaret shook her head. These men won't stop until they've killed something. And if they can't find the mountain lion, they might start looking for someone to blame closer to home. Amos understood what she wasn't saying. He was already an outsider, already suspect. If anyone discovered what he'd done, the consequences would be severe. What would you suggest? He asked. Release her tonight. Right now if you can. Get her so far away that the mother lion follows and stays away. Then you go to that meeting tomorrow, and you look every man in the eye, and you tell them you've seen nothing unusual. Can you do that? He could. He should. But as he looked back at the barn, thinking of Scout waiting inside, something in him resisted. I need to make sure she's ready. That the leg will hold up to the journey. Margaret's expression softened. You're a good man, Amos Creel. Your father would be proud of the kind of person you turned out to be. But goodness doesn't protect you when people are scared. Promise me you'll think about what I said? I promise. She handed him the basket. Some food, bandages, other supplies. Consider it a gift, not credit. You've been carrying enough weight without adding my ledger to it. After she left, Amos stood in his shack unpacking the basket. Inside, wrapped carefully, was his father's childhood sketch of the ranch, one he'd sold to Margaret years ago during a particularly desperate time. She'd kept it safe, and now she was returning it. The drawing showed the ranch in its prime, buildings straight and proud, fences intact, cattle dotting the pastures. His grandfather had drawn it, capturing a vision of what the place would become. Amos pinned it to the wall above his father's Bible. 2 artifacts of legacy, one showing what had been built, the other teaching what mattered. He thought about stewardship, about the responsibility to protect, about his father's belief that some things transcended profit. Then he went to the barn and sat with Scout, knowing he'd run out of time to delay. Tomorrow, he told her. Tomorrow we take you home. You and your mama will get you somewhere safe. I promise. Scout tilted her head, and in that moment Amos felt the full weight of what he was about to lose. Not just the cub, but this sense of mattering. This feeling of being needed for something more than filling another man's work order. But that was the price of caring. The price of doing right. You didn't get to keep what you saved. You only got to know that you'd saved it, and hope that was enough. He spent the rest of the day preparing. He studied his old maps, identifying routes into the deep wilderness where humans rarely ventured. He packed what little food he had, gathered rope and blankets. The mother lion watched from her usual spot on the ridge, and Amos wondered if she understood what was coming. If some instinct told her that change was near. That evening, as the sun set across the plains, Amos stood between his shack and his barn, looking at the land his family had claimed 3 generations ago. The sketch showed what it had been. Reality showed what remained. But maybe legacy wasn't about keeping things the same. Maybe it was about knowing when to let go, when to choose what mattered over what was easy. His father's watch read 3:15. Time stopped and time moving forward. Tomorrow Amos would move forward. He'd release Scout, face the town meeting, and accept whatever consequences came from choosing mercy over fear. But tonight, he'd spend one last evening with the unlikely friend who'd reminded him what it felt like to be trusted, to be needed, to matter. That gift alone was worth whatever price he'd have to pay. The morning Amos had planned to release Scout, he found something that changed everything. Caught on the rough wood of his fence post, fluttering in the breeze, was a scrap of blue gingham fabric. Small, torn, the kind of material used for a child's dress. His blood went cold as he examined it, seeing the fresh thread pulls, the way it had been snagged recently. Someone had been here. A child had been here. He searched the area frantically, finding small boot prints in the dust near the barn. They led from the direction of Calloway's ranch, circled the barn at a careful distance, then headed back the way they'd come. Whoever it was had been watching, had seen, and hadn't said anything yet, or the hunting party would have already arrived. Amos's carefully laid plans collapsed. He couldn't release Scout today, not with a witness out there who might talk at any moment. He needed to know who had seen, what they'd seen, and what they intended to do about it. But there was no way to find out without revealing his own guilt. He spent the day in a state of anxious preparation, knowing that the town meeting that evening might be his last chance to control the narrative. If someone was going to reveal his secret, he needed to be there when it happened. Maybe he could explain, make them understand. Maybe he was finished. The church was packed when Amos arrived just before 7. It seemed like every adult in Dead Rock had turned out, their faces grim and determined. He found a seat in the back row, trying to make himself invisible while his eyes scanned the crowd for any sign of who might betray him. Ben Calloway stood at the front, speaking with Sheriff Dalton in low, tense tones. Other ranchers clustered in groups, comparing notes on losses. Amos spotted Margaret across the room. She caught his eye and gave a small, worried shake of her head, a warning he didn't need. The atmosphere was charged, dangerous. Calloway called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming. I know it's been a long few weeks for everyone. We've lost livestock. We've spent time and money on hunts that have turned up nothing, and this predator is still out there. Tonight, we need to make some hard decisions." He laid out the situation in stark terms. 14 animals dead now. The hunting parties had found tracks, scat, evidence of a large mountain lion in the area, but the cat itself remained elusive. Some suggested it was more than one animal. Others thought it might be denning nearby, which would mean cubs, more predators to deal with in the future. "I'm proposing we take more aggressive action," Calloway continued. "Poison stations at strategic points. Professional hunters brought in from the city, and a systematic search of every property, every building, every possible hiding place within 10 miles of Dead Rock." The room murmured approval. Amos felt his palms sweating. Sheriff Dalton stood. "Ben, I understand the frustration, but poison is dangerous, could kill dogs, could endanger children, and searching private property without cause, that's a legal problem. Then let's make it voluntary," Calloway shot back. "Anyone who has nothing to hide should have no problem allowing a search. Anyone who refuses, well, that tells us something, doesn't it?" Eyes turned toward Amos. He felt the weight of their suspicion, their fear looking for a target. He stood slowly, knowing he had to say something. "I don't have any objection to people looking at my property," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "But I think we're letting fear drive us to extreme measures. Mountain lions are part of this land. They have been since before any of us arrived. Maybe the answer isn't to kill everything that frightens us." "Easy for you to say," someone called out. "You don't have livestock to protect." "I don't have much of anything to protect," Amos admitted. "But I know that poison doesn't discriminate. It kills what it kills. And I know that when we act out of fear instead of wisdom, we usually regret it later." Calloway's face reddened. "Are you saying we should just accept these losses? Let our animals be killed while we practice wisdom?" Before Amos could respond, a small voice spoke from the side of the room. "The mountain lion isn't killing your animals." Everyone turned. Sarah Calloway, Ben's 8-year-old daughter, stood from where she'd been sitting with her mother. Her face was pale but determined, and in her hand she clutched a piece of blue gingham fabric, the missing piece from the dress that matched the scrap on Amos's fence. "Sarah, sit down," Ben said, his voice sharp. "No, Papa, I have to tell. I've been lying, and it's wrong." The room went completely silent. Sarah walked to the front, her small boots loud in the quiet. "I've been sneaking out to Mr. Creel's property. I know I wasn't supposed to, but I was curious, and I saw something." Amos's heart stopped. This was it, the end of everything. "I saw the mountain lion," Sarah continued. "The mother and her baby. The baby was hurt and Mr. Creel was taking care of it. He made a splint for its leg and wrapped its wounds and fed it. He saved it, Papa." The room erupted. Ben Calloway's face went from red to purple. "You what? You've been going near a mountain lion. Do you have any idea?" He whirled on Amos. "You've been harboring that predator? Feeding it? while we've been hunting it? Let the girl finish, Sheriff Dalton said, his hand raised for quiet. Sarah's eyes were bright with tears, but she kept talking. It wasn't the baby killing things. It was its mama, but only because she was staying close to watch over her baby. And they weren't mean. They were gentle. The baby played like a kitten. The mama brought food for it. Mr. Creel was helping them. Helping them! Calloway's voice shook with rage. Those animals have cost us thousands of dollars. They've put all of us at risk. And you, he advanced on Amos, who stood his ground. You've been protecting the very thing that's been destroying our livelihood? The cub was injured, Amos said quietly. Caught in barbed wire on your property. Its mother came to me for help. What was I supposed to do? Let it die? Yes, Calloway shouted. You were supposed to put it down like any sensible person would. Or at the very least tell us it was there, so you could kill them both. To protect what's ours. The argument escalated, voices raised throughout the church. Some sided with Calloway. Amos had betrayed them, put his sentiment for an animal above the community's needs. Others, fewer in number, questioned whether one injured cub was worth all this anger. Margaret tried to calm things down, but she was shouted over. In the chaos, Sarah's small voice spoke again. Mr. Creel saved my life. The room quieted slightly. What are you talking about? Ben asked. Last week when I was watching his barn, I slipped near the ravine. I was going to fall and the rocks were loose. I was scared, but the mother lion came. She walked along the ridge above me, and her weight made rocks fall that gave me a path to climb back up. She helped me, like Mr. Creel helped her baby. That's nonsense, Ben said, but his voice lacked conviction. Mountain lions don't help people. I saw it, Papa. She looked right at me, and she could have hurt me, but she didn't. She helped. Sheriff Dalton stepped forward. Amos, is this true? You've been sheltering a mountain lion cub on your property? There was no point in denying it now. Yes, for about 3 weeks. I've been treating its injuries. I was planning to release her tomorrow. Take them both far into the mountains, where they wouldn't be a problem for anyone. That's not good enough, Calloway said. He turned to the crowd. This man has been lying to us, hiding the very predator we've been hunting. His actions have caused continued losses. He needs to be held accountable. I say we ride out there tonight, finish this, and make sure Amos Creel understands there are consequences for betraying this community. The crowd rumbled with agreement. Amos saw faces he'd known for years transform into something harder, driven by anger and fear. Margaret tried to object, but she was one voice against many. Sheriff Dalton held up his hand. Nobody's riding anywhere tonight. This is a legal matter now. Amos, you're going to have to show me this animal, and we're going to have to decide what to do about it proper-like, with all due respect. Sheriff, Calloway said, his voice cold. The law has been pretty ineffective so far. Maybe it's time the community handled things ourselves. Men started standing, reaching for coats, preparing to ride. Amos realized with growing dread that this wasn't a discussion anymore. It was a mob forming, and mobs didn't listen to reason. He looked at Sarah, still standing at the front, tears running down her face. She told the truth, probably thinking it would help. Instead, she'd lit a fuse that was now burning toward explosion. Please, Amos said, his voice cutting through the noise. Give me until morning. Let me take her to the mountains like I planned. No one else has to be involved. You'll never see either of them again, so you can hide evidence? Calloway shook his head. No, we settle this tonight. The crowd moved toward the door, a mass of determined anger. Amos found himself swept along, knowing that by the time they reached his property, there would be no reasoning with them. Scout would be killed. The mother lion, too, if they could find her. And he would probably lose what little he had left. His land, his reputation, maybe his freedom. As they poured out of the church into the cold night air, Amos caught sight of Margaret's face. She looked stricken, helpless. Sheriff Dalton was trying to organize the mob into something resembling order, but it was like trying to contain water with his bare hands. Amos had one thought. He needed to get to his property first. He needed to free Scout and her mother, give them a chance to run before the hunting party arrived. It might already be too late, but he had to try. He broke from the crowd, running for where he'd tied Patience. Behind him he heard Calloway shouting, organizing riders. The hunt was on, and this time the prey wasn't just a mountain lion. It was Amos himself, a man who'd chosen compassion over community, and was about to pay the price. Amos pushed patience harder than he ever had, the old mare responding with more speed than he'd thought she possessed. The 6 miles between Dead Rock and his property had never felt longer. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of the mob organizing, horses being saddled, men shouting, the scrape of rifles being checked. They'd be coming soon, a wave of anger and fear that wouldn't stop until something was destroyed. He had maybe 20 minutes, maybe less. When he reached his property, he vaulted off Patience before she'd fully stopped and ran for the barn. "Scout!" he called out. "We're leaving, now!" The cub appeared from the shadows, sensing his urgency. Her ears were back, her body tense. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, the mother lion was already moving. Amos could feel it, the way the night seemed to shift around her presence. He grabbed rope, a blanket, the remains of his supplies. His hands shook as he tried to organize everything he'd need for a night journey through rough country. A map. He needed a map. He rushed to the shack and found an old survey chart of the territory, spread it on his table, and began marking a route with a stub of pencil. The high country to the west was his best option. 3 days' ride for a man on horseback, but the lions could move faster overland. There was a valley there, remote and wild, where he'd hunted elk as a young man. Water, game, caves for shelter. If he could get them there, they'd have a chance. He sketched the route quickly, landmarks, creek crossings, the narrow pass through the mountains. His handwriting was barely legible in his haste, but it would have to do. He folded the map and shoved it in his pocket. Back at the barn, he tried to figure out how to move Scout quickly. She was strong enough to travel, but unfamiliar with being led. The mother lion would follow if her cub did, but one wrong move and they'd scatter into the night, making them easy targets for the hunting party. He was preparing a makeshift lead when he heard horses approaching from a different direction than town. His heart sank. Had some of Calloway's men circled around? But the voices that called out were familiar. "Amos! It's Dalton!" "Don't shoot!" Sheriff Dalton rode into the yard, and behind him, impossibly, was Margaret Hendry on her mule. They both looked grim but determined. "What are you doing here?" Amos asked, confused. "Buying you time," Dalton said, dismounting. "Calloway's organizing the mob, but he's doing it his way, sending riders to check their weapons, getting lanterns, making it formal. That gives us maybe an hour before they arrive." "Us?" Amos looked between them. "You can't be part of this. You'll lose everything." "Already decided," Margaret said firmly. "Wade's going to help you get those animals out of here. I'm going to slow down the hunting party. Margaret, they'll let an old woman worry about herself. Now show us what we're dealing with." Amos led them to the barn. Scout tensed at the strangers but didn't flee. Dalton let out a low whistle. "She's bigger than I expected." "And you're telling me she's gentle?" "She trusts me." "Her mother less so, but she won't attack if Scout's calm." "Where's the mother now?" "Out there!" Amos gestured to the darkness beyond the barn. "Watching. She knows something's wrong." Dalton studied the situation with a lawman's tactical mind. "Here's what I'm thinking. Margaret rides back and tells Calloway I came out here to assess the situation first, that I need time to determine if there's actually a threat. That'll slow them down, maybe convince some of the more reasonable folks to wait for official action." "And us?" Amos asked. "You and I take these lions as far as we can before Calloway shows up. When he does arrive, I'll be here to meet him, and you'll be gone with the animals. I'll tell him you ran, that I tried to stop you, but you had too much of a head start. It's close enough to the truth that he'll believe it. You'd lie for me. I'd bend the truth to prevent a lynching, yes." Dalton's expression was serious. "I've seen what mobs do, Amos. I won't be part of it again. Besides," he glanced at Scout, "your father once helped me when I needed it and nobody else would. I remember debts." Margaret stepped forward and pulled Amos into a quick, fierce hug. "You're a good man. Don't let them convince you otherwise. Now go." She rode off into the night, back toward Dead Rock and whatever confrontation awaited there. Amos watched her go, his throat tight with gratitude and fear for her safety. "We need to move," Dalton said. "Show me your route." Amos pulled out the hastily drawn map and explained his thinking. Dalton nodded approval. "It's sound, but we can improve it. There's an old mining road that cuts west through the foothills. Nobody uses it anymore, but it would save you half a day's travel. I'll show you where it connects." They worked quickly, Dalton adding notes to Amos's map while Amos prepared Scout for travel. He fashioned a loose collar from soft rope, something he could hold without restraining her too much. Scout allowed it, her trust in him absolute even in her agitation. "The mother lion is the wild card," Dalton observed. "How do we ensure she follows?" "She will. She's been following her cub for weeks now. As long as Scout moves, the mother will track her. And if the hunting party catches up..." Amos met his eyes. "Then I lead them away from the lions. Give the mother and Scout a chance to escape. That's a fool's plan. It's the only one I have." Dalton was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "All right. But we do this smart. We set false trails, create confusion, make it hard for them to know which way you went." They spent the next 20 minutes preparing. Dalton rode his horse in wide circles around the property, creating tracks that led in multiple directions. He scattered items, a torn piece of Amos's shirt here, a dropped canteen there, making it look like a hasty, panicked flight with no clear direction. Meanwhile, Amos loaded patience with minimal supplies. Food, water, blankets, his rifle, the pocket watch, his father's Bible, Margaret's returned sketch. The few things that mattered if he never came back. Scout stayed close to him, seeming to understand that something important was happening. Outside, Amos caught glimpses of the mother lion pacing closer, her anxiety building. "It's time," Dalton finally said. "I can hear them coming, still a ways off, but they're on the move." Amos took a deep breath. This was it, the moment that would define everything that came after. He could still stop, turn Scout over to the mob, try to preserve what little he had. But even as the thought formed, he knew he couldn't. Some choices weren't really choices at all. He led Scout out of the barn, and immediately the mother lion materialized from the darkness. For one tense moment, Amos was face to face with her, close enough to see her eyes reflecting the lamplight. She was magnificent and terrifying, raw power held in check by her need to protect her cub. "I'm taking her somewhere safe," Amos said softly. "You follow us. Stay close but stay hidden. Understand?" The lion didn't respond. Of course she didn't. But something in her posture shifted, acceptance maybe, or just recognition that this human had helped once and might help again. Amos mounted patience, keeping the rope attached to Scout loose in his hand. Scout moved when the horse moved, staying close. The mother lion faded into the shadows but didn't leave. He could feel her presence tracking them. "Go west," Dalton instructed, pointing. "Follow the creek bed for the first mile, it'll hide your tracks. Then pick up the old mining road. It's overgrown but passable. Keep moving until dawn, then find shelter and rest. They'll hunt during the day, but if you're far enough ahead, they'll have trouble finding you." "What will you tell them?" "That you were gone when I got here. That I tracked you west, but lost you in the rocks. It'll make me look incompetent, but I'll survive that." Amos extended his hand, and Dalton shook it firmly. "Thank you. For everything, thank your father. He taught me what kind of man was worth being." Dalton stepped back. "Now go, and Amos, good luck." "You're going to need it." Amos urged patience forward, and Scout moved with them. They headed west toward the creek bed, toward the mountains, toward whatever waited in the darkness ahead. Behind them, the lights of Dead Rock glowed against the night sky. Somewhere back there, a mob was gathering. Somewhere back there, Margaret was fighting to buy him time. Somewhere back there was everything familiar, everything he'd ever known, but ahead was freedom for Scout, for her mother, maybe even for himself. The creek bed was shallow this time of year, more rock than water. Patience picked her way carefully, and Scout moved alongside with surprising grace. The mother lion was a ghost in the peripheral vision, sometimes visible, often not. They traveled in silence, except for the sound of hooves on stone and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. After a mile, Amos found the mining road Dalton had mentioned. It was barely visible, overgrown with sage and rabbit brush, But it was there, a path through the wilderness that men had carved and then abandoned when the silver ran out. How fitting, Amos thought, that his escape route was someone else's path to a dream that had died. He pushed on through the night, checking the map by moonlight, trusting Patience's footing on the rough ground. Scout never faltered, never pulled against the rope. She seemed to understand that this journey was important, that the human leading her was taking her somewhere she needed to be. Hours passed. The night deepened, then began to lighten toward dawn. Amos's body ached from tension and cold, but he didn't stop. Not yet. Not while he could still hear his heart pounding with the fear that behind them, somewhere in the darkness, angry men were following. As the first pink light touched the eastern sky, Amos finally allowed himself to look back. The plains stretched empty and vast behind them. No sign of pursuit. Either they'd gotten far enough ahead, or Dalton and Margaret had bought them more time than he dared hope. He found shelter in a cluster of rocks that formed a natural cave, just large enough for him and the animals. Scout curled up immediately, exhausted from the journey. The mother lion settled on a ledge above, watching both her cub and the approach from below. Amos sat with his back against stone, his father's rifle across his lap, and tried not to think about how far he still had to go. The journey was just beginning. The danger was far from over. But for now, in this moment, they were safe. Scout was safe, and that was enough. Dawn broke across the mountains with a beauty that felt almost cruel in its indifference to human struggle. Amos had rested maybe 2 hours in the rock shelter before pushing on, knowing that rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. Scout moved more slowly now, her injured legs stiffening from the night's hard travel. The mother lion paced alongside them, her agitation growing with each mile. By mid-morning, they reached the narrow canyon passage that Dalton had marked on the map, the only viable route through the mountains to the remote valley beyond. The walls rose steep and sharp on either side, maybe 20 feet apart at the widest point, narrowing to barely 10 feet in places. It was a natural choke point, the kind of terrain that made Amos's instincts scream danger. The mother lion stopped at the canyon entrance, her ears flat, a low growl rumbling in her chest. She sensed something Amos couldn't yet see or hear, threat approaching from behind, from ahead, from everywhere. Scout whined softly, picking up on her mother's distress. Amos dismounted and checked his rifle, his father's rifle, carried for years, but never fired at another person. The weight of it felt different now, heavy with possibility. He'd always thought of it as a tool, a means of survival. But in his hands at this moment it was something else. A line he might have to cross. Easy, he murmured to the lions, to Patience, to himself. We just need to get through this canyon, and then we're home free. But even as he said it, he heard what the mother lion had already detected, hoofbeats echoing off stone, voices carrying on the wind. The hunting party. They'd somehow closed the distance during the night, tracked him, despite Dalton's false trails. And now they were behind him, maybe an hour away, maybe less. Amos urged Patience forward into the canyon, pulling Scout along. The mother lion followed reluctantly, her whole body tense with the wrongness of being trapped in this narrow space. They'd made it perhaps a quarter-mile in when Amos heard a horse approaching from ahead, from the direction he was heading. His heart sank. They'd sent riders around, cut off his escape. He was boxed in, but the rider who appeared was Sheriff Dalton, his horse lathered from hard riding. He must have circled wide through rougher country to reach this point before Amos. His face was grim, but determined. Thought you might end up here, Dalton said, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. It's the only good route through. They're behind me, Amos said. I can hear them. I know. Calloway's leading them. Margaret did what she could, but he wasn't having it. They rode out within an hour of when she got back. Dalton dismounted and checked his own rifle. Listen to me. This canyon opens up about a mile ahead onto a plateau. Beautiful country, water, shelter, everything these cats need. But you've got to get through first. And Calloway? I'm staying here. I'll meet them at the canyon entrance. Tell them they can't proceed without proper legal authority. It'll slow them down, Wade. They'll go through you if they have to. Maybe, but I'm betting most of them won't shoot a lawman to chase a mountain lion. Ben Calloway might, but the others, they'll hesitate. That hesitation is what you need. Dalton extended his hand. Get those animals to safety, Amos. Make this mean something. They shook hands, and Dalton turned his horse back the way he'd come. Amos watched him ride toward the confrontation he knew was coming, a man choosing principle over safety. It was the kind of choice Samuel Creel would have respected. Amos pushed forward through the canyon, the walls seeming to close in with each step. The terrain grew rougher. Loose rock, sharp inclines, places where patients struggled for footing. Scout moved gamely, but was clearly in pain, the long journey taking its toll on her healing leg. At one point, when the path became too steep and narrow, Amos had to dismount and half-carry the young lion, her weight surprising him, even though she wasn't yet full-grown. The mother lion stayed close now, her earlier wariness of Amos forgotten in her concern for her cub. She climbed alongside them, sometimes ahead, testing paths with her superior agility. Several times she chose routes that Amos wouldn't have seen, her instincts superior to his maps. They climbed for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one. Sweat soaked Amos's shirt despite the cool mountain air. His arms burned from carrying Scout over the difficult sections. Patience was showing her age, breathing hard, her steps becoming less sure. Then impossibly, they broke through. The canyon opened onto a plateau that took Amos's breath away. It was everything Dalton had promised and more, a hidden valley ringed by mountains, a crystal stream cutting through the center, stands of pine and aspen providing cover. Game trails crisscrossed the grass, evidence of deer and elk. This was wild country, untouched, the kind of place that existed in memory more than reality now. Scout seemed to sense the change immediately. She pulled away from Amos's support and limped forward on her own, sniffing the air, her tail moving with something like joy. The mother lion moved past Amos without hesitation, joining her cub, both of them exploring this new territory with growing confidence. Amos led Patience to the stream and let her drink while he removed Scout's makeshift collar. His hands shook as he worked the knots loose. This was it, the moment of release. The end of their unlikely bond. Scout shook herself once the collar was off, then looked at Amos with those amber eyes. For a long moment, they regarded each other, man and predator, savior and saved. Two beings who'd found each other in desperation and formed something that transcended the normal boundaries between species. The mother lion approached, cautious but deliberate. She came close enough that Amos could smell the wild scent of her, see the old scars on her muzzle from years of survival. She sniffed Scout, then looked at Amos, and in her eyes he saw something impossible to deny. Recognition, gratitude, understanding that this human had given her back her cub. She made a soft chuffing sound, a vocalization he'd never heard before. Then she turned and started leading Scout toward the tree line, toward shelter and safety, and the wildlife she was born for. Scout followed her mother but kept looking back at Amos, her steps hesitant. Part of her wanted to stay. He could see it. The bond they'd formed wasn't easily broken. But the mother lion called to her, and instinct won over attachment. Scout took a few more steps, then a few more, until she was at the edge of the trees. Amos watched them go, his throat tight with emotions he couldn't name. Pride, loss, satisfaction, grief, all tangled together in a knot that he couldn't untie. Then he heard it. Gunshots, distant but clear, echoing up through the canyon. Multiple shots, rapid. The confrontation he'd dreaded had begun. Dalton was facing the hunting party, and from the sound of it, words had given way to violence. Amos grabbed his father's rifle and ran back toward the canyon entrance, leaving Patience at the stream. He couldn't abandon Dalton, couldn't let the man sacrifice himself for Amos's choice. Behind him, Scout and her mother disappeared into the trees. Free at last, safe. But the price of their safety was being paid in blood and gunfire somewhere below. And Amos Creel ran toward it with his rifle in hand, knowing that the reckoning he'd delayed was finally here. Amos reached the canyon entrance to find a scene balanced on the edge of violence. Sheriff Dalton sat on his horse in the narrow passage, rifle raised but not aimed, blocking the way forward. Behind him stood 6 mounted men, led by Ben Calloway, all armed, all clearly beyond patience. "This is your last warning, Sheriff," Calloway was saying, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Step aside or we go through you." "You don't have legal authority to pursue onto that plateau," Dalton replied, his voice steady. "It's protected territory, part of the Federal Wilderness Reserve. You have no jurisdiction there. We have the right to protect our property, our families, from an injured cub and its mother trying to survive." "That's not protection, Ben. That's revenge." Amos scrambled down the rocky slope, his boots sliding on loose stone. Every head turned at the sound. Calloway's face darkened when he recognized him. "There he is, the man who's been lying to us for weeks." Amos raised his hands, showing he wasn't holding his rifle threateningly. "The lions are gone, released. They're in the valley beyond, miles from any ranch. They're not your problem anymore." "I don't believe you," Calloway said flatly. "And even if it's true, you need to answer for what you've done. The losses we've suffered because you chose animals over people. I chose mercy over fear." "There's a difference." One of the other men, a rancher named Hutchins, spoke up. "My children are scared to play outside. My wife won't let them go to the creek alone. That's what your mercy bought us, Creel. And killing an injured cub would have changed that." Amos took a step forward. The mother lion was hunting near town because she was staying close to her baby. Now they're both gone far away. Give it a few days and you'll see. The killings will stop. Or they'll get worse, Calloway countered. "A mountain lion that's learned humans won't fight back is a dangerous animal. And you taught her that lesson." The standoff stretched, tension building. Amos could see Dalton's jaw clenched, his finger near the trigger. The sheriff was prepared to fight if necessary, but against 6 armed men, it would be suicide. And Amos knew he couldn't let that happen. "I'll come back with you," Amos said suddenly. "To Dead Rock. Face whatever consequences you want. Just leave the lions alone. They're not bothering anyone anymore." "How do we know that?" Calloway demanded. "How do we know you're not lying again?" "Because I give you my word. Your word doesn't mean much right now." The argument might have continued, escalating until something terrible happened, but a sound cut through the tension, a child's scream, high and terrified. Coming from somewhere above the canyon, every head snapped toward the sound. Calloway's face went white. "Sarah?" The scream came again, desperate. "Papa, help!" Calloway vaulted from his horse and started climbing toward the sound, the hunting party forgotten. The other men dismounted as well, searching for the source. Amos spotted her first, Sarah Calloway, on a narrow ledge maybe 30 feet up the canyon wall, surrounded by loose rock. She must have followed the men in secret, tried to climb to get a better view, and gotten herself trapped. "Don't move, baby," Calloway shouted. "Stay completely still." But Sarah was panicking, shifting her weight, and Amos could see what was about to happen. The rock beneath her feet was shale, unstable, the kind that shifted in layers. Any movement could trigger a collapse. "Ben, stop," Amos called out. "If we all go charging up there, the vibration will knock her loose." Calloway froze, torn between action and helplessness. "Then what do we do?" Amos studied the cliff face, with eyes trained by years of navigating rough country. There was a route, narrow, dangerous, but possible. "Let me try. I'm lighter than you, and I know this kind of rock." For a moment he thought Calloway would refuse out of pride or anger, but fear for his daughter won out. "Please, just get her down safe." Amos handed his rifle to Dalton and started climbing. He moved slowly, testing each handhold, distributing his weight carefully. The shale was treacherous, shifting under his boots, but he'd climbed worse. He talked as he climbed, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Sarah, honey, I need you to listen to me. Don't look down. Look at my voice. I'm coming to get you, but you have to stay very still. I'm scared," she whimpered. "I know, but you're brave. You were brave enough to tell the truth at that meeting. You can be brave enough to stay still now." He reached the ledge and carefully positioned himself beside her. The rock groaned under their combined weight. Below, the men watched in frozen silence. "All right," Amos said softly. "I'm going to put my arm around you, and we're going to climb down together. Nice and slow. Trust me? Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. Amos wrapped his left arm around her waist and started the descent, finding footholds by feel, moving with the patience of a man who understood that rushing meant death. They'd made it maybe 10 feet when the inevitable happened. The shale beneath Amos's right foot gave way with a crack like breaking ice. He fell, instinctively pulling Sarah close and twisting to take the impact. His free hand shot out and caught a rocky outcrop, jolting them to a stop. Pain lanced through his shoulder, but his grip held. They hung there, suspended by Amos's one-handed grip on stone. Sarah clutched against his chest. Below, men shouted and scrambled, but there was no way to reach them. The handhold was already starting to slip. Then Amos heard something that made his blood freeze, the soft pad of paws on rock above them. The mother lion appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the sky. She looked down at them, at the men below, at the desperate situation. Every gun turned toward her. Someone shouted to shoot, but Calloway's voice cut through. "Don't! You'll hit them!" The lion moved along the ridge with fluid grace, her weight shifting as she walked. And where her paws touched the unstable slope, rock began to fall. Not a catastrophic slide, but a deliberate dislodge of loose stone. The falling rocks created a cascading effect, building up below Amos and Sarah, forming rough steps where moments before there had been only smooth cliff face. Whether it was intentional or simple physics, the result was the same. A path appeared crude but climbable. Amos stared in disbelief, then looked up at the lion. She met his eyes for one long moment, then turned and vanished into the high country. Using the newly formed path, Amos was able to find footing. He climbed down the rest of the way with Sarah, both of them shaking. Ben Calloway rushed forward and swept his daughter into his arms, his face wet with tears. Thank God. Thank God. Sarah clung to her father but looked back at Amos. The lion helped us. Just like I said. She helped. The men stood in silence, lowering their rifles. Every one of them had seen it. The mountain lion that could have attacked, could have added to the chaos, instead creating the path that saved a child's life. It defied explanation, defied everything they thought they knew about wild animals. Calloway looked at Amos over his daughter's head, his expression transformed. "I owe you her life. You don't owe me anything. But maybe you owe her something." Amos gestured toward where the mother lion had disappeared. "A chance to live in peace, to raise her cub without being hunted." Calloway's jaw worked, pride and gratitude warring within him. Finally he nodded. "The hunt's over." "Let them go." The other men murmured agreement, shaken by what they'd witnessed. Amos looked at the ground near his feet and spotted a spent bullet casing from one of the earlier warning shots, half buried in the dirt. He picked it up. A small brass reminder of the moment when violence had seemed inevitable, but had been averted by something none of them fully understood. He slipped the casing into his pocket as Sheriff Dalton approached. The lawman's expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes held relief. "I suppose there's still the matter of you harboring a dangerous animal," Dalton said formally, then added quietly, "but given the circumstances, maybe we can call it a misunderstanding. What do you think, Ben?" Calloway held his daughter close and nodded. "Misunderstanding. Let's go home." The hunting party turned their horses toward Dead Rock. The anger that had driven them here dissipated in the face of miracle and mercy. Amos stood in the canyon with Dalton, watching them go, hardly believing it was over. The ride back to Dead Rock was nothing like the angry charge that had brought them to the canyon. The men were quiet, contemplative, each processing what they'd witnessed in their own way. Sarah rode with her father, wrapped in his coat, occasionally looking back toward the mountains with something like wonder in her eyes. Ben Calloway pulled his horse alongside Amos's weary patience. For a long moment he said nothing, just rode in silence. Then, his voice rough with emotion, he spoke. "You saved her. After everything I said, everything I did, you didn't hesitate." Amos looked at the man who'd been his adversary for years, saw the father instead of the rival. "She's a child. Nothing else mattered. The lion could have attacked, could have made everything worse. But she didn't." Calloway's hands tightened on his reins. "I can't explain what I saw up there. Don't know if I even want to try." But I know what it means. What's that? That maybe I've been wrong about a lot of things. About animals. About you. About what matters. He paused, then added, I'm sorry, Amos, for how I've treated you all these years. Amos nodded, accepting the apology without making it harder than it needed to be. Some things were better left simple. By the time they reached town, word had already spread. Margaret's doing, probably, or maybe just the way news travelled in small places. People gathered in the street as the hunting party returned, ready for explanations. What they got instead was Ben Calloway standing in front of the church, his daughter by his side, telling them about a mountain lion that had helped save her life. The story seemed impossible, but Sarah confirmed every detail, and the other men backed it up with varying degrees of awe and discomfort. The narrative that had driven Deadrock for weeks, the dangerous predator that needed to be destroyed, crumbled in the face of this new truth. What replaced it was more complex, harder to navigate, but ultimately more honest. 2 weeks later, another town meeting was called, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. People came curious rather than angry, ready to discuss rather than demand. Ben Calloway stood at the front again, but this time he proposed something radical. I'm setting aside 500 acres of my northern range as a wildlife buffer zone. No hunting, no trapping, no killing of predators unless they pose an immediate threat to human life. It's not much, but it's a start. He looked at Amos, who sat in the front row this time instead of hiding in the back. And I'm offering Amos Creel the job of managing it. Fair wage, proper contract, if he'll take it. The room buzzed with surprise. Amos felt dozens of eyes on him, waiting for his response. He thought about his father's watch, frozen at 3:15, about the Bible passages on stewardship and mercy, about Scout's amber eyes and the mother lion's impossible gratitude. I'll take it, he said. Not for the money, though, I won't lie and say I don't need it, but for what it represents. A different way of living with the land instead of just taking from it. Margaret stood from her seat. The store will support this. I'll donate supplies for building shelters, monitoring the territory, whatever's needed. Sheriff Dalton added his voice. I'll work with Amos to develop guidelines, legal protections that balance ranchers' rights with wildlife preservation. It won't be perfect, but it'll be better than what we've had. Other voices joined in, some enthusiastic, some skeptical, but willing to try. Not everyone agreed. Change never came that easily. But enough people had been moved by Sarah's rescue, by the impossible sight of a predator choosing mercy over violence, that the conversation shifted. Deadrock began to imagine a future where humans and wild animals weren't simply enemies locked in endless conflict. The weeks that followed brought changes both practical and subtle. Amos moved into a small cabin on Calloway's land, fixed up and sturdy. His wages allowed him to pay off his debts to Margaret, though she insisted on celebrating with a new entry in her ledger, one that showed credit in his favor for the first time in years. The hunting parties disbanded. The livestock killings stopped, just as Amos had predicted they would. He visited the plateau regularly, bringing his father's camera, an old box brownie he'd found in his mother's trunk. He photographed the landscape, the stream, the places where he'd seen tracks. He never saw Scout or her mother directly on these trips, but he knew they were there. Scat, prints, the occasional kill site carefully covered. They'd made the valley their territory, and they were thriving. Then, one evening in late summer, as the sun painted the mountains in shades of amber and rose, Amos spotted movement near the tree line. He raised his binoculars and felt his breath catch. Scout had grown. She was nearly full size now, her coat thick and healthy, moving with the fluid grace of a mature mountain lion. The limp was completely gone. Her leg had healed perfectly. She was magnificent, powerful, wild. Everything she was meant to be. The mother lion emerged from the shadows beside her, and for a moment the two cats sat side by side, surveying their domain. Amos watched them through the binoculars, his eyes stinging with unexpected tears. They'd made it. Against all odds, despite all the threats, they'd survived and found their place in the wild. As if sensing his presence, Scout turned her head in his direction. The distance was too great for eye contact, But Amos felt it anyway, a connection that transcended the physical space between them. A bond forged in desperation and trust, in blood and healing, in impossible circumstances that had somehow become possible. He lowered the binoculars and pulled his father's pocket watch from his pocket. 3:15. The moment time had stopped. But as he stood there on the plateau, watching two lions disappear into the wilderness they'd reclaimed, Amos understood something new. Time hadn't stopped at all. It had simply changed what it was measuring. Not the passage of hours and minutes, but the accumulation of moments that mattered. Choices made, trust given, lives saved. He'd fulfilled his father's legacy, though not in any way Samuel Creel could have predicted. The ranch was gone, but the values remained. Stewardship over exploitation, mercy over fear. The belief that some things were worth protecting simply because they were worth protecting. A month later, Amos stood on his family's original homestead plot, watching Ben Calloway's construction crew repair the old barn. The buffer zone project had expanded, incorporating Amos's land with his permission. The barn would serve as a headquarters for wildlife monitoring, a place where ranchers and conservationists could meet on common ground. Margaret arrived with lunch, spreading a blanket in the shade, while Amos's father's childhood sketch, now framed and hanging in his cabin, captured what had been. But Amos was more interested in what was becoming. The barn rising from its decay, the land healing from years of neglect. The community learning to see differently. "You did good," Margaret said, handing him a sandwich. "Samuel would be proud. I just did what needed doing. That's what he always said too." She smiled. "Funny how that works." Sheriff Dalton joined them, taking off his hat and wiping his brow. "Got the new ordinances approved by the territorial governor. Legal protections for the buffer zone, guidelines for predator management that don't involve automatic killing. It's official." The three of them sat together, eating lunch and watching the barn take shape. Around them, the Montana plains stretched vast and beautiful, wild and tamed in equal measure. Somewhere in the mountains to the west, a mother lion and her cub hunted and slept and lived free. And here, in Dead Rock, people were learning that safety and compassion weren't mutually exclusive, that the wild didn't have to be conquered to be respected, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in colors that defied description. Amos thought about bridges, not the kind built from wood and steel, but the fragile, precious kind built from trust and courage. The bridge between human and wild, between fear and understanding, between what was and what could be. That bridge still stood, held together by one desperate plea, one impossible bond, and a choice to value mercy over survival. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it was enough. Amos Creel touched his father's watch one last time, then slipped it back into his pocket. 3:15, the moment everything changed. The moment time started moving forward again, measuring not loss but possibility, not ending but beginning. And somewhere in the wild country beyond Dead Rock, a mountain lion and her cub remembered the broke cowboy who'd chosen compassion over fear, who'd risked everything for nothing more than the right thing. They remembered and they thrived, and the balance held.